Thank you for, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting. Is this the way I change the slides? As Jenny said, she was an outsider, but I think I'm the real outsider here, being an architect. So my preoccupation with coffee comes, of course, from being a coffee lover, but not in the way that you see it, but more for my part, is more from the social point of view, how the coffee has this universal role in connecting people, and has had this historical, like this cultural level of significance. It's a language sign. And it's beyond the effect of being a stimulus. It's a greeting device, it's a ritual, it's a context for sharing ideas. And that's my interest in that, bringing it, how this is an inspiration for designing an environment or a space. Many times you go to a business meeting, you get coffee just because it makes you feel more confident, or it's a tool to be more free. We draw a lot of inspiration, and I think a lot of inspiration has come from cinema. Coffee has played a very major part in normalizing, connecting the characters to each other, relating it to the audience, and make it a link that creates right intimacy and casualness and normality. And this applies in real life as well, and when we are executing spaces, in how we read the spaces, how people move through the spaces, what do they do when they occupy the spaces, and how the space makes them feel to each other, how they relate. There's been a lot of talk, of course, in your industry about the coffee concept and how it's a leading commercial space nowadays with co-working spaces and it's co-living spaces, and all the hotels trying to emulate this cafe experience. And a lot of these contemporary spaces have been built upon the idea of a third space, which is not our home, not our office, but places that are completely neutral, and with like-minded people try to connect, either to be connected with each other or to be alone, to reflect, to contemplate. There's been a lot of competitiveness in the cafes, making them attractive spaces, and that has led unfortunately, to an era that people don't really care about what they do in these spaces, but they go for the spaces, or they don't go for the interaction, but they go for the fulfillment of inner needs, of like social media needs. And that is something that in our work we're interested in researching and seeing how this has been something that draws attention away from what really the important part is. There's been a lot of fertile ground for such spaces with an increasing lack of private space in urban metropolis. These spaces also feel like an oasis or space of community, and they increasingly become larger and larger and occupying complexes, and reusing industrial spaces and making cool environments. In this presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about our work and how it's inspired by the idea of moving space and the idea of unplanned program, of how there's this important reference from a French architect called Bernard Tchoumi in the 80s in Paris, where there was this competition for this big industrial location that was turned into a park. And what back in those days, it wasn't like an easy thing to do, but now it's more common that you create spaces that bring together many things. He tapped into the ideas of the folly. The folly basically is a useless space. It's a structure that doesn't really have any use, but it gives the opportunity, gives the freedom for people to move in, to do whatever they want with it. And now you think about it as it's let's say the contemporary co-working space, or the contemporary co-live space, that you have these cool areas that you can go in and do anything you like. But back in the day, it wasn't an easy idea to convince the state, the country, to pay millions of euros for such structures. I lived in Paris for 2 years, and I visited these places, and it was an interesting thing to see kids, people occupying it, going there with a coffee in their hand, improvised concerts, people sleeping in it, so many different programs that has been the inspiration, one of the inspirations for our work and what we try to do. So in our work, we have been preoccupied with the idea of bringing urban elements into a smaller scale and creating environments where interaction can happen in a more free way. and creating pause spaces in urban tissue so that people can come together and feel in a different way their environments. This is an installation we did in Flatiron area in New York, where we were invited to create a public art piece that was a temporary space that was installed in front of the Flatiron building. It was a very open brief, design something that will make people come together and attract attention. So we created this space where it's not actually a space, it's a series of arts with light and hammocks, so that it doesn't really define a space, but it creates an attraction point. So it was installed in December, in the middle of a very freezing winter, but people were flocking around to hang out on it, not from an Instagrammable point of view, but really because it was an element that was thought as being a connector. So people were coming there and were hanging out around all this time in the winter. So these are a few images of it. Then we were invited by Design Miami, is this big art fair and design fair in Miami Beach, to create a performance space. Like we're here sitting today, it's a space where there were talks happening and panel discussions. And sometimes there were panel discussions of 1 or 2 people, or of hundreds of, like 10 or hundreds of people. So we wanted to create a space that doesn't feel static. We wanted to bring in this idea of randomness and flexibility in the space. And we created a space that were made of movable elements, that people will be able to move around and sit wherever they want, hang out with whoever they want, create mini environments in the same space, so it doesn't really feel that anyone is obliged to use it in a specific way. So this idea of freedom and this idea of freedom of how people want to gather and how people want to be connected was brought in this playful element. Again, we work a lot with pop-ups and temporary installations because we think that this is a ground for experimentation, for researching and learning why people come together, what is the modes of bringing people together, and what we can do with space design in order to make the experience even stronger. For a Biennale of Interiors, an expo in Belgium, we created a pop-up cafe and a restaurant in the center of the exhibition that was, again, the element of a circle as a sign of bringing people together, and how we create the idea of a market inside this space. A place to connect and to disconnect from the expo, but also to connect with people, with each other. And it was this complex, big, basically very big chef's table, let's say, where people will be able to move and sit wherever they want, and grab food from their little kiosks and bring it and sit with their peers and with their colleagues and discuss. We try to explore alternative ideas of bringing people together that are not necessarily the standard idea of a cafe or of a sitting space, but challenge the way people sit with each other and the way people communicate with each other. This is a project in Switzerland that is for a hostel. Hostels are by default places for interaction where new connections, and it's a place for individual travelers to mingle and meet people. And the core of these areas is to not only provide a nest for people to sleep in for a night or two, but also to create, people who move around hostels are a tight community all around the world. So this is a hostel in the middle of the forest. So we wanted to create, this is an undergoing project that we were called there to design, and now it's being developed by a local school of students that study wood technology. And we created a space that is an elevated space, and the only public space is basically a hanging net in the middle of the space, where basically you force people to come up, and everybody sits around an atrium, and the only way to move around is to basically bump with each other and interact. And I'm looking very forward to seeing it realized. It's in the last phase of realization. And I'm very curious to see how it will evolve in real life. We've been interested in the idea of connector and what happens in the interaction of people when there's this feeling that there is a common thing that connects everybody, so this common element. In this case, this is a beach club in Corfu in Greece. The common element becomes one single roof. It's a geometric roof pattern that creates an enormous area underneath it that connects a restaurant, 2 cafes, a beach bar, and a club. And it's made out of a huge bamboo roof, so there's one single element that is a shadow from the bamboo that is the only common thing these spaces have. And flexible curtains, transparent curtains, allow spaces to be divided every time in a different setup. So if the owners want to connect the space, they connect it to make it a big club space, or they create intimate environments for a restaurant or for a cafe experience. In a more domestic environment, we have this standard idea of what a home is. It has a bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, and a bath. So then, in our work, we try to strip away any ideas of actually designing in detail, and try to tap into the concepts and what makes the space design really change the way you live in a space. For this summer home, we took advantage of the year-round good weather and tried to create a new typology that reflects the way of living in a vacation home, especially in Greece, which is with direct contact with the outdoors, where social activity only unfolds in the summer. If you go for vacation for a few weeks or a month, it's only about food and conversations. There's nothing else you do in this space. You go to the beach, you come back home, and you hang out. So why do you need an interior living room? Why cannot the living room just be an outside living room? Basically, forcing people to, through design, directing them with a bold gesture to live we can dictate really the way that one lives and interacts in this building. For another project in New York, the question was we were invited to create a new public space in Chinatown area in New York, and the challenge was, these are all ongoing projects, so these are the projects that are being evolved at this time, and we try to be more experimental in how we bring people together. So the question was how to create a pose space in one of the busiest areas in Manhattan. And for this public plaza in Chinatown, we were designing a social connector. It's basically a landmark that becomes an attraction point and a social connector. And we try to do a new type of public space that really has the spiritualness as being in the middle of Chinatown, but at the same time has this impact as a landmark. It sits in between, as you saw there, in 2 big crossroads. So we're creating a big canopy that the sense of enclosure and the sense of being under a hat automatically gives you this intimate feeling and attracts people to go and go into this public space and communicate with each other. This is a school complex that was a competition that we have won in Finland, and it's undergoing in the next 2 years. So Finland has one of the most progressive educational systems in the world, and are constantly promoting new educational models and architectural innovation, mixing in their building small and big children, have a non-book class policy, and promote real-life experiences. So we see this building as a city within city. A school that is an introverted world with interior streets lit just from the sky. So a network of corridors are lit from the sky, and the classes become basically urban blocks in this micro scale. And the classrooms, the education system kind of moves from inside to the outside, so they don't really have the idea of a classroom, but they have the idea of an education system that goes beyond that. So it is like a labyrinth that children can move around freely, and really, for us, it was an experimental project. Hopefully, it will be built. It's still in the permits process, so it's not the easiest part to get through a building like that. And that this is the image here is the main square of the school, which is basically the place where all the activities happen. We have designed more conventional spaces that I will go through quickly. I wanted to take this out, actually, because they're not so relevant from this presentation, but we try to be experimental where we can in the rest of our projects. We have to deal, of course, with the realities of a client. And this is a beach club in Mykonos that, again, it taps into this idea of bringing people together, but not in a sense that we would normally do. A restaurant in Athens for a hotel. And going through quickly, because I know you've been here for a while. So this is the project we started designing in, we work with this coffee brand, a Colombian coffee brand in New York called Devoción. It's a new business. It's been around for 5 years, and now we're opening next week their third location in Flatiron. So the idea, we're doing that with ideas that we're working with them in creating the architectural branding of the space. What will be the feeling that the customers will feel when they go into the shop? And there's a lot of attention put in the atmosphere, in the selection of the spaces. We actually, we went with them for a trip in Colombia to actually see and get the atmosphere of the place where the coffee comes from. We visited the farms. We got a lot of interest in what's in the mentality there. The concept is that we don't work with we don't want every store to be the same. We want to create very different experiences using some kind of meanings that are the common denominator in all this. The idea of green, the idea of the strip vibe, the idea of the filtering of light, elements that we saw in our trip in Colombia and in our research, that we try to find the essence of what the brand is and connected with the actual branding that they're doing. Creating, again, found intimate moments that are random and as not planned as possible. In the beginning of the design, we started thinking about how we bring in this street element, how we create alternative ways of sitting that are not really dictated. So we don't tap into which chair to design, which leather to use, but we try to get into the movement of the space and the flow around the space, and how to bring in these elements and create atmosphere. This is the new place that opened in downtown Brooklyn last year. There's a middle island of, we call it the island, the oasis. So really creating moments where people can there are no plugs, there are no connections for laptops. So it's a place really to be alone and not be bothered by all this social media technology. We work with them also to scout places, because it's not only about the quality of the product that they have, but we really are interested in the quality of the spaces. So, of course, location is important, but we have agreed that it's more important the quality of the space and what we can bring in. The space on the left is the original location in Williamsburg, and we were fortunate enough to have this beautiful skylight, and really, it's the one that creates the space qualities. So in the scouting of the spaces, we try to look for and dig in for spaces that we can make something out of it. The one on the right is the new location in Flatiron. We're looking for how we can bring in nature in the space, which means the space has to have a lot of light, a lot of natural light for the plants to live. It has to have some natural elements that we can use to create intimacy, and of course, in the sense of creating flow and having the opportunity to create seating arrangements, the space and the layout is very important. From this Colombian influence, we take this idea of the porch and how this in-between space, the transitional space between the street and the cafe, and what's the importance of the culture, the importance of this space in Colombian culture, how we can transform it in a contemporary space, and what does this in-between space means for the feeling when someone enters in. You don't enter from the street right away into the cafe. You get through this transition space that not only gives a different way of sitting, but it gives it creates a feeling before you come in the space. Or the idea of a flow, of how you go around elements, how you move in the space, that really gives the idea. It's more of the cinematic experience. Director use film and camera techniques to really drive attention where they wanted to. That's what we try to do with movement in the space, that how a customer can come in and he or she is going to get one cup of coffee, but how can we give them the full experience of moving throughout the whole space, even if they come for 1 minute or if they come to hang out for a whole hour. And these are a few images of the atmosphere that's being created. And lastly, we work between also in small scale. This is trying to be more experimental where we can in creating experiments of sitting and how people bring together. This is an installation with objects in Art Athena Art Fair, where we're called to create not just an art piece, but also a space where people will be able to sit and interact. We created this very heavy bubble-looking furniture that they created an outdoor plaza. And it's amazing to see how not only people sitting there and hanging out, but how kids see it as a playground, how other people see it as an art piece and they don't touch it. So it's really this ambiguity of the design is an interesting experiment to see how people interact. And we're working now with Lexus. Lexus has a new space in Manhattan that it's a creative hub. Of course, they will have a cafe in there because that's their idea of a third place. So they invited us to rethink of a concept of what different can we do with a place like that. They didn't want a real cafe. They wanted a place where people can hang out, but at the same time to have the flexibility to become a gallery or to become just an attraction. We're designing these movable elements in the same sense like the art installation earlier, where it can become can be stuck in very different ways, and people will just jump on it and see. We will explore further how they will interact. We don't know. So we basically give them a canvas to do whatever they want and give us information on how they use the space. The space will be used for lectures and will be used for presentations, but for us, that was the ground of experimentation to see what we can do with this original idea about something that's completely useless, but people will find a way to use it in interesting ways.